First and foremost, I want to thank everyone for their time today and joining us for this webinar. We have a group of amazing panelists. This panel is brought to you by the Clean Air Task Force Climate Equity Initiative. It will be going over understanding it will be going over disenfranchised and underserved communities. Just for a little bit of a background, Clean Air Task Force was a 25-year-old organization that has been working on climate policy. We have offices where our main office is based out of Boston. We're also in DC and Brussels. We're an international organization. We have been engaging on the ground here as part of the Climate Equity Task Force in 3 key regions, one being the river parishes and located here, where I am in Louisiana, Ironbound, Newark, and also the Navajo Nation. The Climate Equity Initiative. So our Climate Equity Initiative actually launched back in 2021. We started off kind of trying to identify the barriers and challenges and also potential opportunities for collaborating with environmental justice communities, advocating for change and adoption of solutions to break down systematic barriers and challenges that these communities may face as being a part of these environmental justice communities. In doing so, we have been on the ground for a better part of a year now, and all these communities not just conducting research through focus groups and understanding, but facilitating conversations with EJ leaders and also bringing back our feedback, what we hear, into how it affects our policy work. Next slide, please. Thank you. Like I said, so here's the kind of the timeline of how Climate Equity Initiative has kind of come into inception. Like I said, our first phase was doing deep research because we need to truly understand from an academic standpoint where we were starting at and what was actually being said about communities, where was the data out there and how it was being understood. And that led us to phase 2, which you guys are actually a part of a webinar series. So thank you so much for joining us. And a system of reports that we've done in collaboration with these communities. Like I said, we've gotten to do a lot of meaningful engagement on the ground. We've gotten to talk with very prominent EJ leaders, folks across different demographics in these particular areas, whether it's young folks, old folks, people with disabilities, retirees. We've gotten to kind of broaden our spectrum of how we understand and how we engage with communities by making sure that we talk to people that represent the communities in all aspects. So from there, I'm going to introduce you guys to our amazing panel. And like I said, we're joined by 4 amazing people who have been doing this work and have made substantial contributions. The first person we have up is Kyle Jim. He's the executive director for Dene Introspective, which is a Native-led community-based organization in the heart of Navajo Nation. We're also joined by Jasmine Symington, who is a joint doctoral candidate in public policy and sociology at the University of Michigan. Jasmine's work as part of the team that developed the Index of Disadvantage. So she'll be able to tell us more about that in coming through this presentation. And we're also joined by Dr. Rihanna Rogers, who's a distinguished expert from the Center to Advance Racial Equity and Racial Equity Policy at RAND Corporation. She has substantial work in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and has earned numerous accolades in her position that has led to international authority and participation in action research. And also we're joined from our own teammate here from Clean Air Task Force, Grace Linzer, who's a climate equity associate who actually authored this paper and presentation. Grace has an outstanding focus in addressing challenges that are facing these disenfranchised and underserved communities, and compounding the effects of inequities that are experienced, and also trying to chart pathways for best practices for engaging with communities in a just energy transition. So I'm going to pass it over to Grace. Thank you all.
Thanks, Desmond. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Desmond said, today I will be giving a brief overview of the newest publication from the CATF Climate Equity Initiative. And this paper, which gives a broad overview of some of the challenges facing disenfranchised and underserved communities in the United States today, it reflects upon the compounding effects of inequity and the multifaceted nature of environmental risk. Now, before delving into this analysis, I do want to note that while this lit review, has drawn heavily on statistics and on data, it's really crucial for us to appreciate the unique challenges and histories of each community that we're talking about. So just wanted to kind of center that point here. Now, having said that, our analysis has pointed to some common ground, and that is the most critical issues affecting disenfranchised and underserved communities are those that directly impact their health, their economic well-being, and their overall prosperity. As I know many on this call are thinking about how we can work towards a just, decarbonized economy, it's really important for us to remember that our work must account for the real concerns of these communities. So with that in mind, I will get into an overview of this paper. So when we began this research, we quickly came to see that a challenge lies in defining precisely what constitutes a disenfranchised or underserved community. Often policymakers, grapple with this, trying to define a term that is so complex, and this complexity is magnified when it comes to allocating funds specifically. The Justice 40 initiative serves as a notable example of this. So when the Biden administration introduced the Justice 40 initiative and identified just over 23,000 census tracts as disadvantaged to receive 40% of the program's benefits, numerous community leaders and environmental advocacy groups criticized the program for omitting communities they believed deserved this designation. For instance, the Alaska Municipal League criticized the Justice 40 initiative for not considering the impact of rising temperatures on once frozen landscapes in the state. The issue is that melting landscapes are causing sinking infrastructure in Arctic and subarctic regions, including schools, homes, such as the one pictured here, and roads. And while the Justice 40 program considered agricultural land loss, it missed this challenge of liquefying earth in Alaska. So the Alaska Municipal League urged the Biden administration to acknowledge this unique sort of vulnerability, this unique disadvantage, and to make special considerations for the affected communities. So this is just an example, but it illustrates how challenging it can be to define disenfranchisement and truly account for the unique inequities communities face, given historical, social, political, and environmental contexts. Really, a one-size-fits-all definition just doesn't suffice. So really understanding disenfranchisement requires an intersectional approach, which considers the unique challenges that each community faces. So having recognized this challenge of defining disenfranchisement, our research next explored the strides that current social scientists are making in this regard. A recent project, which served as pretty foundational to our research, is the Multidimensional Index of Deep Disadvantage, which was developed by researchers from the University of Michigan and Princeton University. And we're actually joined here today by one of the wonderful researchers who helped to develop this index. So I will allow Jasmine to discuss this in greater depth. But I do want to highlight just a few points which really shaped the trajectory of this research. So firstly, the mapping of the index, which shows the disadvantage level of 500 major cities and every county in the United States, it really tells us quite a bit. First off, there are 5 clear geographic clusters of deep disadvantage, and those are the Mississippi Delta, the Cotton Belt, Appalachia, the Texas-Mexico border, and a small cluster of Rust Belt cities like Flint, Detroit, Gary, and Cleveland. Also worth noting, many of the native nations, especially in the Dakotas, Nebraska, Arizona, and New Mexico, score high for disadvantage on the index. The mapping also shows us that rural counties are significantly more likely to be disadvantaged. In fact, of the top 100 most disadvantaged communities, 80 are rural counties. Now, this is a new finding, which the researchers highlight especially since many of these rural areas have never been much of a focus for poverty researchers prior. And one final crucial insight, which was really fundamental to our research, is noting that the mapping of disadvantage isn't just about today. It's deeply rooted in historical context. So areas with a long history of racial oppression and environmental exploitation are more likely to be categorized as deeply disadvantaged. The researchers found that their index map aligns remarkably with a historical map of the concentration of enslavement from the 1860 census. Moreover, 21 of the 100 most disenfranchised places are tribal lands, highlighting the concentrated historical oppression of Indigenous communities. Now, this is important because it helps us to understand that this map isn't just a snapshot. It really is a roadmap showing us where historical factors and rural dynamics have played a significant role in shaping disenfranchisement across the United States today. So this index, as I said, was foundational for our research because it guided a systematic review of the literature and evidence on the challenges facing communities of color, rural communities, tribal communities, and low-income communities across the country. And from this review of the literature, there emerged 7 key, what we call characteristics of disenfranchisement. Now, while we don't argue by any means that this is a comprehensive list, this is a list of 7 characteristics which really emerged to us. And I would welcome our panelists to discuss whether these are characteristics you see in your work, or if there are others you think that would be valuable worth discussing. But I'll jump into these. So the first of these is health disparity, and I'll invite Dr. Rogers to discuss the language around that, as we were discussing that before we got on the call. But according to the Index of Deep Disadvantage, individuals in the most disadvantaged areas report a life expectancy of 72 years, which is 10 years less than those in the most advantaged areas. This life expectancy gap is closely tied to chronic poverty, and it significantly increases the risk of various health issues from heart diseases to respiratory problems. As many of us know, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated these disparities, hitting low-income communities of color the hardest. The CDC reported that Native American and Black communities faced hospitalization or death rates over 5 times higher than their white counterparts, pointing to how these health disparities are rooted in socioeconomic factors and systemic inequalities. Now, closely related to health is the second characteristic of vulnerability, which our research illuminated: poverty. The numbers are quite revealing. In the 100 most disadvantaged communities, the average poverty rate is 34.8%, over 4 times higher than the 7.3% in the 100 most advantaged communities. Importantly, both urban and rural communities of color face higher poverty rates than their white counterparts. And despite overall decreases in the national poverty rate, the figure displayed here illustrates persistent disparities. Black and Hispanic communities continue to be disproportionately represented in the population in poverty compared to their overall population representation. And for Native American communities, 1/3 live in poverty with a median income of around $23,000 per year. Turning now to the third characteristic of disenfranchisement, we'll discuss low educational attainment. So recent findings from the U.S. Department of Education confirm that there are significant disparities in educational participation and attainment among low-income communities and communities of color. The COVID-19 pandemic really exacerbated these disparities, particularly for Black, Native American, and Hispanic students. I think, we've heard a lot about how school shutdowns and the shift to e-learning in 2020 and 2021 revealed that Black and Hispanic households with school-age children were 1.3 to 1.4 times more likely to have limited access to computer or the internet. And rural schools, often situated in impoverished counties, face a unique set of challenges due to their remoteness. It's more difficult to attract talented teachers and school administrators, and these areas are often disconnected from social services and volunteer organizations that can provide supplemental educational services as well. And as I mentioned, both online and in-person learning in these rural areas can face challenges due to broadband and infrastructural limitations. And this leads us to our fourth characteristic of disenfranchisement, which is exactly that, poor physical and broadband infrastructure. Before we delve into some of the local impact and examples on a more local level, it's worth noting kind of the broader context. The state of our nation's infrastructure received a less than stellar C- grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers in 2021. And this deficiency disproportionately affects low-income communities and communities of color, shaped by decades of racial bias and discriminatory infrastructure policies. If you take Mississippi, for instance, many rural Black communities there grapple with extreme infrastructural challenges. A 2017 report highlighted a 100% increase in closed county bridges in a year, with 46% of county roadways deemed in poor or very poor condition. In Jackson, where 80% of residents are Black, public funds allocated to infrastructure repairs dwindled since the 1970s, and this has resulted in serious health and safety issues. In fact, for over a month in 2021, the entire city lost access to potable water due to a breakdown in the water system, illustrating the real-world consequences of failing infrastructure. For tribal areas, there's even a more stark reality. Dilapidated roads, neglected waterways, and limited access to the electrical grid pose significant challenges to the social and economic well-being of Native American communities. And I'll ask Kyle to speak a bit more about this challenge today. Adding to these challenges, of course, is the broadband divide. Leaving many low-income rural and tribal communities without access to broadband infrastructure and the internet. An assessment by the American Indian Policy Institute found that 18% of homes in tribal areas have no internet access, and communities of color also face significant disparities. A 2019 Pew report revealed that while 80% of white adults say that they have broadband access at home, only 71% of Black adults and 65% of Hispanic adults can say the same. And as I've already touched upon, the COVID-19 pandemic made this disparity even more visible and showed it was a stark reminder again of the inequities embedded in our infrastructure systems. So turning our attention to the fifth challenge in disenfranchised communities is housing insecurity. Now, while millions of Americans grapple with rent payments, the burden is notably heavier for renters of color, who often allocate 30 to 50% of their household income to rent. This financial strain contributes to higher eviction rates, particularly in neighborhoods with greater racial diversity. And contrary to common perceptions, homelessness is not confined to urban centers. It is an escalating concern in rural areas as well. A recent Harvard School of Public Health poll revealed that over 1/3 of rural residents view homelessness as a local problem. In tribal communities, housing insecurity manifests as overcrowding, and this affects approximately 9% of the population, which is actually 3 times the national average. Furthermore, Native American reservations and allotted lands confront a considerable annual deficit of about 68,000 housing units, which is triple the projected need. So moving on to the sixth shared vulnerability, disenfranchised communities grapple with exposure to environmental harm. As I'm sure many folks on this call are aware, since I think many people here work in the environmental space, low-income individuals and communities of color bear a disproportionate burden of poor air, water quality, toxic waste, and environmental disturbances. One 30-year study reveals a pattern of hazardous waste facilities placed systematically in neighborhoods where poor and people of color reside. And this is compounded by a limited political power for advocacy. EPA analysis continues to highlight stark racial disparities and climate impact. Black and African-American individuals face higher rates of childhood asthma, a 40% higher cancer risk, and a 75% higher likelihood of living in a fence-line community. Hispanic communities also endure challenges, with nearly half located in ozone-violating counties. And Native American reservations, which have been historically targeted for waste dumping, now face climate change impacts like coastal erosion, storms, droughts, and crop shortages. Now, getting to our last characteristic of disenfranchisement here, since I've been throwing so many statistics at you. The seventh challenge shared by disenfranchised communities is the lack of political voice. Now, political voice encompasses activities influencing government action and voting, and is a real critical component of civic engagement. Now, this vulnerability is particularly pronounced in low-income communities, tribal areas, and communities of color. Today, various structural and political barriers impede individuals in these communities from fully exerting their political voice. Government policies like voter ID laws disproportionately affect voters of color. For instance, approximately 25% of Black voting age citizens lack government-issued photo IDs, restricting their voting rights where such laws are in place. Reports indicate that 14% of Black and Hispanic voters encounter difficulties finding polling locations, and tribal communities often have to face long travel distances and also have a lack of traditional mailing addresses, contributing to a broader challenge for rural communities, which are often designated as civic deserts. So as a consequence, the interests and needs of these communities often go unrepresented in political spaces. And this lack of political voice poses a significant problem, allowing the other inequities and vulnerabilities discussed here today to persist without adequate intervention. I briefly want to touch upon here another element of this paper, which examines a critical aspect of vulnerability, and that is how certain groups face compounding vulnerability. Certain groups within disenfranchised communities, such as those within the LGBTQ+ community, the elderly, minors, people with disabilities, immigrants, and veterans, these groups experience compounded vulnerability. Discrimination, limited political voice, and social isolation further restrict the autonomy and social capital of these individuals. It's very important to understand that vulnerabilities are not isolated. They are complex, they are interrelated, and inherently linked. And if you take, for instance, the interplay between educational attainment and poverty levels, or the influence of housing security on health incomes or outcomes, these challenges compound and reinforce each other. And it creates a web of complex barriers for community prosperity. Often, however, we see that policymaking falls short in addressing these challenges, often in isolation due to jurisdictional constraints. And this approach leads to incomplete solutions, overlooking the interconnectedness of compounding inequity and multifaceted vulnerability. So in order to truly understand and address the challenges faced by disenfranchised communities, it is important to understand how these vulnerabilities are inherently linked and compounding. Now, I promise I'll wrap up here soon so we can get to the exciting part of this webinar, which is our panel. But just briefly here, I do want to touch upon one more thing that demands our attention, and this is a theme which emerged from our research, which is very important, which is the tendency of some communities to resist and be mistrustful of external actors. Now, oftentimes, disenfranchised and underserved communities have a complex history with governments, with industries, and with other outside actors, and as such, harbor a significant degree of suspicion that profoundly influences their interactions with external entities today. You can consider how uneven business transactions, how environmental exploitation and a general disregard for community values by outside actors in the past has left these communities with a lingering legacy of skepticism. So it's a tough sell to trust outsiders or to entrust their land to others, given past experiences where communities have borne the brunt of economic and environmental costs without reaping the benefits. If we delve into real world examples of community mistrust, what's evident is that the response to external initiatives hinges on the trust built during the process of engaging with the community. This mistrust can translate into community resistance, and how outside actors approach this resistance is absolutely critical. Ignoring public outcry, abruptly ending engagement based on assumptions, these sorts of responses can make things much worse. And it's assuming that better understanding of a community that will lead to favorability, labeling responses of community members as NIMBYism, or relying solely on financial compensation can really backfire, deepening mistrust with communities and driving communities away. So addressing community resistance requires understanding underlying mistrust. It demands acknowledging historical power dynamics and going all in on transparency, cooperation, and a genuine long-term commitment to engaging with communities. And while there's no assurance that a community will have trust with outside actors, understanding the complexity of challenges that communities face is a crucial first step. So that was, the aim of this paper was to try to come to sort of a foundational understanding of some of those challenges. Now, having said that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And we can turn to our wonderful panelists who are with us today. Dr. Rogers, Rihanna, Jasmine, Kyle, thank you so much for being with us here today. I'd like to start by asking each of you to reflect on some of the findings from this paper. Perhaps we can start with you, Rihanna. Having heard more about these findings, more about this paper, can you speak to how these findings resonate with you, given your own work at the RAND Center?
Yeah, and first off, thank you for having me here. I'm excited about the work that we're engaging with together. There's a lot of intersections. So just to give you a little bit of background about my center's work, my center sits in the president's office of RAND. For those who don't know what RAND is, it was the think tank started by the US federal government in the 1940s. I have a really interesting look as a result of that. I look at everything equity. And so I'm really big on intersectionality between things like infrastructure equity, digital equity, social equity. And given that I have that kind of very high landscape, everything that you've said resonates. It's permeating all of the work that I'm engaging with right now. I'll just give an example. I'm currently on a CISA project. For those who aren't familiar with CISA, this is the US federal government cybersecurity task force, just on a meeting right before this. And right in the middle of us talking, I just shared with colleagues the reports that we were just talking about. And I literally said, we were just talking about the intersections of rural and urban and populations in the BIPOC spaces and how you can't disaggregate those data points because you will over-bias data samples. By doing so, you have to look at them together. And so I just want to thank you for showing that because I already shared them with that information. But I would say the last piece, and I'll pass it along. I think the disaggregation of information, which is what you were showing, and by breaking down different specific intersectional points, overall in equity research, we need to do a better job of that. We have a tendency to make broad, large swaths and saying X group is impacted Y way. And it makes it's actually a bit more disenfranchising by doing such things like that, because one group may have more access to wealth, technology, infrastructure from a same disenfranchised group than another. And if we make these kind of lump sum assessments, we really could be ostracizing aspects of those groups. So I really appreciate what you're doing, and I'll pause there.
Thank you. That's a really helpful insight. Kyle, perhaps we could turn to you next. Given your work with the Diné introspective and your focus on environmental justice and social justice, I wonder if you could speak to how this paper might align with some of the work that you're doing as well.
Yes, yate tachini nishle nadan dane bashishi bidani dashiche torachini dashanele Kyle Jim Yinship. Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Jim, and I represent Disenfranchised, which is a community-based nonprofit organization. And into regards of the environmental justice, the Navajo Nation has been established as a copy and paste of the federal government system, and it was initiated through oil and gas companies. And so the whole system is founded upon resources and minerals and energy. And in the beginning, the United States government wanted to extract these resources. And so in order for this to happen, to be legitimized, contracts need to be drafted and signed. And so they had to help push the Diné tribe into formalizing the Navajo Nation government. And so that even pushes us into the World War II and extracting uranium to help further push the agenda of the industrial military complex. So with everything happening right now, it does affect our farmland, our grazing land, as well as the soil, the animals, and the plants. So with what we are trying, what we are doing as an organization is that we are getting the people to come together and acknowledging our concerns from all realms, and that yes, we are experiencing disenfranchisement, and that this is something that needs some change needs to happen. And we had addressed the power plants. We have two major power plants in the San Juan County that is very much adjacent to the San Juan River. And if you look on the NASA website, during the operations of the power plants, there was a methane plume above the Four Corners region. And so this methane plume has caused the air and much of the soil to be acidic. And so our people, including myself, I had dealt and experienced with asthma. I had a hard time breathing as an adolescent, and very much of our people here on the agriculture community, we have trouble with our soil. So we have to amend the soil. We have to put nutrients back into the soil. And even with the social justice, we have very much just talking about the health disparities, the poverty, the housing, the education, that this is very much we dwindle in extreme poverty as the United States goes into a frenzy when we hit 10% unemployment. But yet within the Navajo Nation, we easily touch 55% unemployment. So majority of my people that I see in my communities, they're unemployed. About half, more than half of everybody's unemployed, but we remain resilient. Much of the people that don't necessarily have a 9 to 5, they resort to food vending, farming, ranching. And so we have to find numerous ways to work with our land, and even just from a legitimate standpoint, that the land is in trust. It's in a trust land, so it actually still belongs to the government, and it's only seen as a beneficiary. The land's only promised to us for so long, and even with the trust land, it makes it very difficult to gain a business site lease or even a home site lease. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. And I know that your organization has a lot of very important programs that I'll ask you about in a little bit here, but I do want to allow Jasmine to jump in here as well. And Jasmine, of course, I would love to ask you about your work on the Index of Deep Disadvantage, but before I do that, is there anything else from this presentation, from this paper, that resonates with you, given your wide range of expertise on housing inequality and disaster recovery and the like?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for allowing me to participate in the conversation. I really enjoyed reading the report. I think where I'll pick up is on the paper's discussion of a lack of political voice. That part really resonates with a lot of the work I've been doing, both on the Index of Deep Disadvantage and then on some other qualitative projects on housing and disaster recovery. And I think political voice can be easily overlooked in the research world when we're focused on numbers, and even as we're focused on stories, we might not always use this language of lack of political voice. But I thought I could tell a story about some field work I did in rural South Carolina after the Index of Deep Disadvantage, and basically was having this conversation with a pastor in a town that was in the process of recovering from back-to-back floods. And he kept saying that, residents are trying to get access to FEMA aid, but there's this huge information gap. People don't know about all the programs that are available to them. And as a result, they're just living in these molding homes. And I asked the pastor, how do you wrestle with that as someone who has some capital in the area? And he told me this story about traveling to council meetings and traveling to the state legislature to basically advocate to them to extend funding deadlines. And when I was reading the report about lack of political voice, I thought about that story, because it's a case where I had to ask myself, what if that pastor had not basically exercised his social and political capital? And even living in a disenfranchised community, there was a moment for him to exercise that. And I thought about the many communities on our list that might not have had that experience or had access or had someone with that kind of access. And so I'm happy to talk more about the index, but the point about lack of political voice really struck me as a really key takeaway, even for research scholars who are trying to understand not just from a quantitative perspective, what does disadvantage look like, but what are the implications of it? What does it look like to live in communities that we might call disenfranchised or disadvantaged?
Yeah, that's a really important point. I mean, I think the point on the lack of political voice is that it's a manifestation of disenfranchisement and also a huge contributor to it as well. It's the way that it's, again, I mentioned compounding inequity, and that's a prime example that you've offered. So thank you. But yes, I would love to now ask you a little bit more about the Index of Deep Disadvantage. Maybe you could tell our participants a little bit more about how this index was developed, and if there were any findings from your time working on it that really struck you.
Sure. So I guess sort of the the background as to why this project was even formed was that two researchers at the University of Michigan and Princeton, Kathy Eden and Luke Schaefer, had written a book called $2 a Day, which is really about individual level poverty and how people navigate those constraints. And when they stepped away from that book, they actually wanted to ask a different question. So instead of asking how individual people navigate circumstances of low socioeconomic status, they wanted to ask, how do communities where there may be concentrations of people who have been disenfranchised, how do they navigate day-to-day life? And so as a part of this new project, they were asked by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to create this measure of multidimensional disadvantage. I want to be careful about the term disadvantage because I know that there are many ways to talk about basically what we all maybe come to understand as historical exploitation and disinvestment. But so we basically started out thinking about what the main socioeconomic areas of this compounded disadvantage could look like. And so I won't get too deep here, but we basically run a statistical model called principal component analysis, which allows us to basically capture multiple indicators and then rank counties based on their poverty rates, their different measures of health status, so life expectancy and low birth weight. And then we have a measure of socioeconomic mobility. And as you can imagine, we sort of wrestled with which indicators to include and what geography level to do this at. Do we do neighborhood level? Do we do city? Do we do county? And so the index that we put out into the world is, one of 20, I can tell you. And it was really, honestly, really exciting to see how you all have taken that and sort of included or expanded it into these 7 domains, whereas ours really only focuses on 3. But we always said the index is just a starting point. And even in our work, we ran different iterations of the index. But with that in mind, the rankings of counties were pretty consistent. And so we landed on this final one. And so we rank counties across the US as well as the top 500 cities based on those indicators that I mentioned, and that Grace sort of summarized in her presentation. And you just really see these stark differences between what we call the most 100 disadvantaged places, which means they had the highest index score, compared to the 100 most advantaged places, which means they had the lowest index score. And just to recap what Grace said, we found that overwhelmingly the top 100 places were rural. They were places that were located in contexts where there was a documented history of exploitation and disinvestment. And for the purposes of this talk, a lot of that was related to environmental injustices. And then the second thing I'll just say about the index, as we sort of wrestled with what are the right indicators and what does it mean to produce a list of counties that we name as disadvantaged based on numbers, we also had a second qualitative component where researchers went and lived in 6 of those communities and conducted interviews with residents and community leaders. And we actually then focused on, how do you navigate this? What does it look like to thrive in this context? Recognizing that as researchers, we don't ever want to be naming communities in a deficit way, but also learning from them about how they actually create life and thrive amidst what we would see as socioeconomic inequality. So I embedded in the South Carolina site, and I'm happy to talk about that qualitative part as well. But that's sort of how the index was born, what we learned from it about these clusters of disadvantage. And then the last thing I'll say is that we just finished, well, about a year ago, we finished a paper where we looked at the trajectory of of counties over time. And what we see is that it's not just, we're giving you a snapshot of where disadvantage is, but it's actually remarkably persistent over time. So the places that are disadvantaged now, we look at them pre and post recession, and we see that they are still trying to recover from the financial hit of the recession. And in particular, the places that whose index score was both high before and after the recession are places with a majority Black populations and places whose economies were overwhelmingly reliant on manufacturing. So there's more to come with the index. We're looking at trends over time, but it was really exciting to see you all expand on it in this report.
Thanks, Jasmine. I've always thought it was so fascinating how you combined quantitative with qualitative research. I think that probably added so much value to your work, and also just much greater understanding of what the numbers were telling you. So I really value that. And perhaps Brianna, we could turn to you now, because I know that you have led numerous projects related to participatory action research, and these projects have played a role in promoting justice for underserved communities. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about this, kind of what lessons you've drawn from this type of research, and how you hope it might inform future advocacy or policy efforts.
Yeah, and thank you for that. So I'm actually going to share a link in the chat box to a project that I'm working currently on in Kern County, California. And just to give you a context of types of work that I do in community-based participatory action research. So I have a long history of doing this in different communities. For folks who don't know, I have a very eclectic background. My work actually started out in tribal archaeology. I used to be the tribal archaeologist for the Seminole Tribe of Florida, working in the TIPO there. And I've worked with indigenous communities abroad in a variety of senses. So I've taught in 5 countries as well. And that kind of community-based work, where you work inside of a community with a community, set parameters for projects, not you as the researcher, but decenter yourself and focus on creating research that's around what community interests, wants, and desires are, is really critical to my work and the work that I do with different populations. So I've taken the models, and I build models in my center. And if you take a look at this link, you can see a derivative model about community-based participatory action research that, using an equity lens, which means gauging it specifically towards communities rather than just making a generic model. This one happens to be around climate equity and how do we hold deliberative conversations. And so just to give you a context of why we chose Kern, my colleague, Dr. Rob Lempert, who actually won the Nobel Prize with Al Gore, is my co-PI. We work together, and he focuses on future studies, and I focus kind of on equity-centered deliberative dialogue. How do we actually have those uncomfortable conversations? So we wanted to choose Kern because it actually is a microcosm of the US. You have, for those who don't know, our former House of Representatives speaker is from Kern County. So there's a large, very predominant Republican base in politics. And on the other side, we also see the start of the Dolores Huerta and Julio Chavez started the Farm Workers Association of America there. So you have a strong kind of democratic grassroots movement base all in the same county. And so we wanted to see, where you have 2 strong kind of bases, can we find ways to navigate together communications and move towards a joint understanding in climate-based understanding? And so what we did is we kind of worked together, and we said, what do we need? What's the distrust? What are the kind of points where both groups, these major groups, found distrust? And what we did was, instead of starting off with assumptions, we spent about 6 months. I use anthropology a lot. We created kinship charts. Who are the leaders in these different groups? Who are the pockets underneath? And we broke it all down, and I shared that with everyone, any group on any side, so that it wouldn't be disillusioning. That's one thing I think often we don't do. There's so much hidden behind the scenes. There's so many private conversations happening, and that's what creates more distrust. So by breaking that private space and making it public, people felt more apt to buy in because they saw that we weren't hiding things. And so what you notice here, and what I'm really excited to report, is after a year, We now have set up this website. It's actually made up of both groups. So they get to choose what goes onto the website. They get to choose to say what things have worked in climate space, what things haven't. We modify things even before we ever send something out to the public. We have this advisory council, which is incredibly diverse. Read over, say, are there any words in here that would be trigger words that would leave you out of this conversation, or a representative like you out of this conversation? And so what it's actually doing is it's creating a safe space and a brave space for individuals on all sides of this conversation to engage with each other. If you dig into the website a little bit further, you'll actually see we've created best practice documents. It's under the resources section to lay out how do you have these difficult conversations without creating chaos, frustration, anger. And one of the things I'm excited about, and if you look at the link on the bottom, it actually says best practices for framing what could be difficult conversations. What are the ground rules you should set up? So that document in there, it says ground rules for engagement. We use that at the beginning of every one of our meetings. And I'm happy to report we've never had an argument, even though we have incredibly diverse views in the room. This model, which is why, you know, I was asked to join this, is something that we're going to be rolling up to the Department of Energy. Because as you know, if we can find ways to communicate across cultural, political, religious, linguistic lines on a small micro study, think about how much we might be able to do if we can roll this up to the US wide.
Wow, that's really amazing to hear about. And I know that so many folks working in the climate equity space will find that incredibly valuable. So we will, I know Desmond and I are nodding along, ready to circulate this around to many of our contacts. So thank you for sharing that. Kyle, I want to turn back to you. I know that we only have about 5 minutes or so left on the webinar now, but hopefully I can squeeze in a few more questions here for you all. But Kyle, I just wanted to ask you, while we're on this topic of thinking about the ways in which communities can inform and advance advocacy initiatives. I understand that your organization really emphasizes the importance of revitalizing identity and resilience and ancestral knowledge as well. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Diné Introspective incorporates traditional Navajo wisdom and practices into some of your initiatives in advancing environmental and social justice.
Yes. So with our balancing the Western society and even our Diné culture, we consult in ceremony, and that includes in the Hogan or in the Sweat Lodge, and more so with our elders, and in even engaging in community meetings along with our peers, our colleagues, other professionals. And through ceremony, we also consult with life elements, simply including the water, the fire, the air, the earth, and plants as medicine. And so even with the medicine wheel, you might be vaguely familiar with that. There's 4 stages. Within the 4 stages, we have the vision, where we're thinking, where we're problem solving as the first stage. The second stage, we're talking, we're networking, we're planning. And then the third stage goes into action, the intellect. And then the last stage, the fourth stage, is reflecting, and even being resilient is our fourth stage. And whether the action was positive, negative, we succeeded or we failed, that fourth stage is important to reflect on, and just acknowledging to be resilient, to try again. Maybe it was in one of the stages that we were lacking some type of energy, or even key individuals, other organizations to provide more of a progression towards our goal. So I feel that through ceremony, it's very important, and And even with all cultures, tradition, as I'm reminded too, we got to put the creator, we got to put God first before we act. Even just simply as starting the day, that prayer is necessary um, to begin the day, or even moving forward with all activities. That prayer is vital. Um, and even just with all the elements, if you're not able to have all the elements there at hand, that we could still pray to the water before we consume. We can still pray to the fire before providing an offering. We can even just pray to the air um, and providing offering through tobacco, mountain tobacco, that our words and in the smoke carries up into the heavens per se, into the air to the creator. And so we always gotta watch what we say, that our words are like arrowheads, that they strike. And so we have to be yeah, we always have to be that we are sincere with everything we say, whether it's you have force with your words, whether it's negative or positive, it always strikes, it always hits. So we have to be sincere with our thinking, our talking, and our actions. And so all of these aspects are physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And in Diné culture, we talk about walking in harmony. And harmony is having that balance. There's a saying, Sa'a Nagai Bik'e Hojon, is the philosophy of our organization. And that's having that balance between the physical realm, our spirit, the stars, and these life elements, that we have to carry that balance, and acknowledging that once we have that balance, we're able to continue on the red road, that we are able to be 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 that warrior that we're all meant to be, and speaking on all realms, that yeah, we're all five-fingered beings, and we're surface people, that we have all of these gifts. We're able to walk, talk, compose of thoughts and ideas, and we're able to act upon. And so at times we get these universal messages, and we act as that vessel. And so we have to protect the land, the earth, the air, the water, the fire. We have to protect our people, our communities. So um, this is a very much a great platform for everybody to express themselves. So I just like to say, "Ahiahet," thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for sharing. It's wonderful to hear how your organization approaches this work, and I think we all have much we could learn from you. So I realize that we've come to the top of the hour now. If folks need to hop off, they're welcome to. And if our panelists could stay on just for a couple more minutes, I just want to do a wrap up kind of lightning round here. We've talked a lot about challenges today. I think I talked a lot about challenges today. But maybe in as few words as you can, although that might be shortchanging it somewhat. I'd like to ask each of you to say what you, if you could tell policymakers or those who are an audience to your work, something about how solutions should be implemented for disenfranchised communities. What would you want them to hear from you today about what makes a successful initiative or an effective solution for communities? Rihanna, perhaps we can start with you on that.
Sure. Well, we were talking about this in advance. I think one of the biggest disservices we do in this work is we don't center hope and empowerment. We have a tendency to center despair and negativity. There's been a wonderful amount of work that each one of us on this call has done in our careers to move the needle forward. And even though we may not see society where we want it to be, we still need all of us to work collectively to actually make us be in a place for us to continue to move and make a better society for all. I jokingly call myself a happy hippie in my work, and I do so because I believe that we need that type of energy to be able to actually continue to do something that's difficult. I also jokingly talk about the anti-Eeyore effect, and yes, I'm talking about Winnie the Pooh, where we don't need to center negativity. We should be centering positivity. There's a lot of positive in each of us that we should center over negative. And so I would challenge each one of you today in all of your work, don't burn out. If you center positivity, you'll be able to do this work a lot longer.
Thank you, Rihanna. Jasmine?
Sure. Well, I echo Rihanna on the importance of hope and encouragement. And I'll just add that I think, especially from the research world, we don't do enough to center community perspectives. And so I think when it comes to policymaking, asking people what they need before imposing particular programs on them, I think is critical to more effective policies. And I'll leave it there since we're being brief.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. Kyle, we'll give you the last word here today on this.
Yeah, I feel that the people need a chance to heal, and that if we can heal ourselves, heal our mind and body through the food, through physical activity, that we can definitely move on towards economic development, that we are able to help ourselves emotionally and regain our strength and our spirit, that we can start moving forward towards helping out one another, helping our families, and that all of this has to start within ourselves, our family, and then we can move on to the community of economic development. There's very much a huge push towards energy, and I feel that before we start tearing up the land, that we have to start with ourselves and the creator first. So I feel that on a positive note, that we can all work together in unity, and it's always about evolution and not revolution. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all again. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you each today and learn from you. We're 5 minutes over now, so I'll let you all go. Thank you to our audience who was able to join us today. As our events team noted, the recording will be distributed to the mailing list. Thank you again to all of our panelists here today.